All right. It looks like the participation is kind of holding steady, so we'll go ahead and get things started. So hello and welcome to Yahara Live. In today's live session, we're talking with special guest Harold Stelzer of OrisDX about ways in which they're bringing new life to the oral care industry. As a reminder, please feel free to leave questions in the chat as the talk goes on. We will happily answer what we can as time allows. To really get things started, I'll pass this one off to Garrett Peterson.
Hi, everyone. As Austin said, it's really excited here to be talking with Harold for a number of reasons. One is that we've had other customers of Yahara on the Yahara Live series before, but Harold is unique in a couple of ways. One is, and we'll talk quite a bit about the platform that he's building and really the approach that's being taken by OrisDX. But another is just the relationship with Yahara. Harold is one of our early, for those of you that don't know, Yahara has a ventures arm of what we do as well, where we invest in early stage biotech and biohealth organizations that we believe we can support well. And Harold is one of our early investments. And so we are both a partner and a vendor to Harold, but also an investor in OrisDX. So welcome, Harold. And I'm so excited to talk about this because, one of the reasons we originally got started and started working was just how exciting the solution of what you're tackling is. So, could you tell us a little bit introduce yourself, and then tell us a little bit about OrisDX and what it is you're all about?
Sure. Harold Stelzer with OrisDX. I've got a 30-year history in the biotech and medical device space. I've worked, my background's in biochemistry and genetics from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I still have a lot of close ties to the state and love working with Wisconsin firms every chance I get. With Oris, I worked for about 20 years with large companies, including Abbott Laboratories, Takeda, Genzyme in the Boston area, and spent the last 10 years helping to build emerging companies, both product-focused companies and service-oriented companies. One of the latest companies that I'm involved with is OrisDX. It's a spin out of the University of Chicago Medical Center. They have brought to life a unique testing solution for head and neck cancer. We get compared a lot to Cologuard in terms of ease of sample collection and can be done at a home or in a clinic, being sent to a central laboratory. And then we do a next generation sequencing profile on Illumina and have the ability to report out a patient result that indicates whether or not the lesion, the suspected lesion in the oral cavity is cancerous or not.
Uh, and Harold, before we get started, and I thank you, whoever sent this question in, but we did get a question, pre-question before this that I want to see if maybe you could talk a little bit about is really when you're talking about oral cancer, how many types of oral cancer are there? Is there really, a main focus of this disease?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the American Cancer Society uh, considers head and neck cancer as one kind of cancer. Oral cancer doesn't really show up as a category,
Hmm.
but it's not brain cancer. That's separate, and it's not thyroid cancer. So it's everything else that's happening in here. There's two primary kinds of cancer, and they're both acquired cancers. That means you're not born with a cancer or a genetic defect that leads to cancer. They're acquired. Squamous cell carcinoma kind of happens towards the front of the oral cavity and into the salivary glands. And then the other one is caused by the HPV virus. So the same virus that women get tested for with pap smears also sets up, and it typically shows up towards the back of the throat. They present very similarly in terms of a suspicious white lesion. It doesn't bleed and it's not painful. It just doesn't go away. And
Mhm.
those are the two primary types. We're launching our product with a 7-panel biomarker set for squamous cell carcinoma. And then we have some separate grant funding to support the optimization of HPV biomarkers that we'll be adding to it. And that gets to about 100% coverage of what we know today about the epidemiology of head and neck cancer.
And something else that I think is really interesting is when you're talking about head and neck cancer, it is a a condition that is becoming more common in younger patients. And so this is part of the reason why, you took on the salivary test, as well as if you could talk a little bit about, working with dentist offices, which is a completely different way of doing this type of cancer screening.
Yeah, it's great. So the founders were is the chief of head and neck surgery at the University of Chicago and a cancer biologist. They had a really clever tool for detecting cancer. As we started better understanding the patient journey and mapping that to where they typically show up, it's typically presents in a dental clinic during a 30-minute hygienist clean. So the hygienist is in there with lights and loops, and they're looking in the oral cavity, and they say, this doesn't look right. It looks a little unhealthy. And they're in there, they can look under the tongue, they can look in the back of the throat, into all the different crevices and folds in the cavity. And so what we were asked to do is bring largely a clinical oncology test and bring it into a dental setting. That's really opened up a bunch of interesting doorways with regards to medical care within dental settings.
Mhm.
Trying to think through how do you process the payments for this, because it's different. Medical insurance is medical insurance and dental is dental. They're two different, and they operate differently. And we've had to do a lot of that software build out with Yahara's support to make sure that we can manage the patient journey from a dental chair to a surgeon's table,
Mhm.
so that we can keep account of, who's positive, who's not, where we're detecting it, making sure that they move on, and then ensuring that those that have had diagnoses of head and neck cancer, there's about 420,000 survivors in the United States. They're at the highest risk of being able to of having a reoccurrence of it. And we want to make sure that they're reminded of it every couple of years or every month, every couple of months, to
Mhm.
get retested, reassessed.
Yeah, and that mode of testing, I think, is literally going to save lives. As you and I have talked before, a lot of especially younger people really aren't frequent visitors of their primary care physician or anything like that. But they are going to the dentist in many cases, and being able to have this test administered through the dentist office. I think is novel, and your investors think so as well. Speaking of investors, when we talked a little bit earlier this week, one of the things that I want to make sure we bring out is something that you had talked about as you're out there raising funds for this idea is the data strategy, and really how important is data even in a diagnostic testing play like you have here? How important was data to investors and to your business model?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you're thinking about data collection, many institutional investors, the first question that they ask is, what's your data strategy? They want to understand, what are you collecting and how are you going to leverage that to help patients out? And what else could you do with the data?
Mhm.
And so for us, it was interesting as you think about, and as we talk to institutional investors, there seems to be large amounts of data based on blood-based testing or stool-based testing in Exact Sciences case, or urine-based testing. There's not a lot of testing that we've done outside of COVID testing from the salivary matrix. And so we were asked early days to make sure that we begin to understand what a multi-omic solution is going to look like and develop the back end in such a way that that data lake captures what are we learning from both the genomics of the testing that we are doing, but what are we learning from the patients themselves? How are they presenting in a phenotypic way? And being able to map all those variables together. Because as Garrett said, what we have learned is that there's a growing incidence rate of 20 and 30-year-olds that do not have HP, they're not a smoker, they're not a drinker, and they have HP or they have oral cancer developing. What we'd really like to understand is, why is that happening? Is it an environmental issue? Is it an exposure issue? Is it a where you live issue? That's what we're trying to get a better handle of over the next couple of years.
Mhm. Yeah, and obviously being able to collect that data well, that's something that Adam and James and other Yahara Lives have talked a lot about. And really just, as you're doing an early stage, one of the things that, I think is important to understand is that as you were moving forward, this is obviously the IP, the primary IP of what you're doing is around the genetics test that you have and the mode of sampling. But you had, because of the fact that you were doing this testing within dental offices, because of the fact that you were trying to operationalize, relatively leanly by using laboratories, contract laboratories and whatnot to get started. You had a fairly complex informatics solution, I would say, need for a early stage startup. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what about your informatics was complex, and what ultimately brought you to us to start talking about how we might be able to implement that for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's three primary providers of electronic healthcare records. Epic, of course, being the biggest one out there, but there's others. And the dental health record world, it's very fragmented. And so we quickly needed to come up with a solution that we didn't sit on top of an EHR, but we needed to work outside of it. That required a portal solution. So once we made the decision to have a portal solution, we had to kind of do soup to nuts. We've got sample kits that we can send into dental clinics. We can send it into a home, do the testing wherever the sample can be collected, because the sample itself is rather easy. You put a couple milliliters of saline into your oral cavity that's provided in the kit. You swish and swirl, get to the back of the throat, and you expectorate that into a 50 milliliter Falcon tube that goes to a central laboratory. So what we needed to do right from the get-go is track all these kits, track the patient, track who's scripting for them, tracking insurance and eligibility information so that we could get reimbursed for the test. And then we had to report out the patient reported result and make sure that it had the ability to integrate back into any number of healthcare records or dental systems. But on top of that, because of only 21% of dentists have the ability to do medical billing, we had to create an entire back office that also did the payment processing. And we've come up with an agentic AI approach in order to solve that. And to get back to the bioinformatics question, there's not a lot of people that have really sought to understand the salivary matrix with genomics and understand, particularly if it's acquired mutations, how do you sort and filter out all the noise that's in there? You've got microbiome, you've got food particles. Some of it's undigested mammalian food, like a raw ham, like a rare hamburger, not a raw hamburger, but a rare hamburger. All of that makes it more difficult to understand whether or not the human cells that we're looking for and the DNA in those human cells and that mutation itself is coming of human origin or not. Therein lies the extra layer of complexity that we've added on to the project, and Yahara and their team was very helpful in putting that together, plus a few others that we found in the genomic space.
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously the operational infrastructure of your solution, and I want to talk a little bit about that from an investment standpoint in a second here, but is interesting. But the other side of this is it's a very good example, and this is something again that James and Adam have mentioned more than once of the bridge that needs to be gapped or walked across when you have IP like you have coming out of the University of Chicago and some other places, and then needing to then operationalize that and bring that into a a commercial workflow. There's a lot of work to be done there, and most of that work, a lot of the work that I know that our team did with you, and a lot of the work that you did, post launching the effort, it is really about hardening the workflows, validating the workflows around the bioinformatics that largely are still the same bioinformatics that came from the original source, but building around that so that you can do that in a commercial platform. That's significant
And
work.
regulated. Again, we're
And
managed as a CLIA
regulated. Yes,
compliant
yes.
laboratory. And so
Yeah.
we had to make sure that on top of the complexity of looking for the cancer, we had to do it and lock into a wet lab and a dry lab soup to nuts setting that we could validate and execute on for every patient sample that shows up into our clinic. And
Yeah.
all of that it's a little bit unique in terms of what we're doing, particularly with the matrix and the automated pathology review of what's going on. And we've institutionalized that, and that's been a lot of fun to create for the team.
So what I'd like to do is come back to a little bit your conversations with investors. I know you spent a fair amount of time raising money initially. I think that the momentum is certainly seems to be on your side now. But can you talk just a little bit about the complexity of talking with investors about you had a couple of challenges, I think, in terms of telling your story. One is obviously the dental health side of this, which I know you found a specific investor that core investor that really understood that space, which was ultimately the goal there. But then the other thing I think that is interesting is that in a lot of cases, especially for diagnostic tests, I think investors are looking a little bit more at saying, "Hey, prove out the technology, prove out the IP." And then look to operationalize it elsewise. You really took a very different approach. You're saying, no, we're going to prove out the operationalization of this along with the IP. In fact, actually, you almost went in with some swagger saying, I know the IP is good. Really, what I need to prove out is the operations side. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of that and now what the investors see as the value of the platform investment that is somewhat unusual in your case?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, it was a learning experience for myself, honestly, and the investors on the other side. Um, Generally speaking, diagnostics can be tough, and they're tough because people want to understand what's the value of the diagnostics, what is it really helping out with, how are you going to get reimbursed for it? And so diagnostics kind of fall into two camps. One is you just pay everything out of pocket because you want to know the answer. And for more complex diagnostics that you're looking for medical reimbursement, you need to really understand what the value is that you're giving back to the ecosystem. And
Mhm.
so we very quickly latched on to that and looked at what can we save employers, payers, the government by offering a diagnostic for a couple $100s. Right now, the current workflow for treating a head and neck cancer patient is somebody shows up at a dental clinic, they see a suspicious lesion, they get a referral to a surgeon. The majority of the time, people are getting lost in that referral process. Remember, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't hurt. And by the time it does bleed and by the time it does hurt, it's a later stage and it requires much more surgical intervention, pharmaceutical intervention, radiopharmaceutical intervention, and then potentially lots of devastating surgery. I've met with a number of patients who have survived, but they're left permanently disfigured. Tongues are gone, jaws are gone. It's really a poor quality of life after that. And that all gets factored into the decision making too for employers, payers in general, with regards to whether or not they want to treat. And so what we want to do is build up a tech stack at the lowest possible price point to allow for a margin on the product itself, but also to save the system money. And I was taught early on, you build something that's value added to the ecosystem, you figure out how you're going to get paid for it along the way. Investors don't always get that piece of it from the get-go. You need to prove that out. And there's steps that you can take to do that, and we certainly feel comfortable with where we sit.
Mhm.
I'd say the bigger challenge for us was, okay, you've got me over the importance of diagnostics. What's your call point again? I go, well, we're going to go to dentists. And so then I have to say, well, how many precision diagnostics are in dental clinics? And I go, none. We're going to be the first to try to do that. And they go, okay, well, come back to us after you have a couple of months of sales data. And so we were fortunate enough to have co-investors at the early beginning that said, we believe in the dental community. One's CareQuest. They operate both a nonprofit but also a small investment vehicle associated with it. And the groups that are involved are all large corporates: Henry Schein, distributor; Cigna, insurer; Colgate Palmolive from a more oral health business standpoint. And so and then the other partner to us was Revere Partners, and they're the largest dental investor in the country. They were one of the first to start out a dedicated fund and do early stage investing. And what we found is the dentists believe in the product. They trust their dentists. They know how dentists are going to behave. And now we're at that inflection point of we're going to be on market in about 45 days. Then with 6 months of data, I can go back to those same institutional investors and say, hey, look, the dentists did what we thought they were going to do. Keep in mind that we did about 450 interviews with dentists along with some support from Cigna on this. And we got back an 80% interest in having a more sophisticated precision diagnostic.
Hmm. Hmm.
When I went to Henry Schein, I go, we should really be working together on something like this. And they're like, well, we don't even have a chapter in our, 10,000 page catalog for products like this. Let's test that market out. So they tested it out with 15,000 of their clients, and sure enough, 80% said
Wow.
validated the market research that we did. Great. Market research is wonderful. Now you have to prove that out. So our hypothesis is it continues to be that dentists are going to step up, rise to the occasion. And as we see more dentists taking on medical testing and areas of what else could we do for our patients, that's where we are coming in with kind of a ground up approach to be able to bring a cancer solution into the dental clinic, and we'll find out by the end of the year whether or not, how it picks up. It's going to be an interesting ride. Stay tuned for us. Make sure you're following OrisDX on LinkedIn.
I mean, it certainly looks so far like the early results are that you're going to see some success, probably some great success. Let's set that aside a little bit. As I said earlier, I mean, obviously you stepped into this with the IP of the cancer test and the genetics and that is or at least initially was your core IP. But along the way here now you have built a platform, and so I guess what do you see as the future of a platform like this that is delivering diagnostic care in this mode? Do you see there being a value there and something that you might expand into in the future?
Yeah, and so we've got an exclusive license from the University of Chicago for the underlying IP on the wet lab testing methodology that gets into the four markers that we're interested in, or the seven biomarkers. What's really interesting, and then the HPV biomarkers, that's ongoing R&D that's going on at the university. What's really interesting is that we uncovered some new intellectual property space in the processing of the data itself. And remember, I went back that blood's pretty well understood, stool, urine. What wasn't really well understood was the bioinformatics coming out of saliva and how do you clean that up? Because we wanted to be able to do this shortly after a meal where there's still food residue. Your microbiome is constantly going up and down with different bugs, and there's DNA there. And so we needed to come up with a thoughtful approach on how to filter and screen those pieces out. So I think that going to be a unique opportunity to look for other biomarkers associated with lung cancer if you bring a sputum sample up. I think that there's an opportunity to look for esophageal cancer, stomach cancer, those that come up naturally into the oral cavity. And if our fingerprint for head and neck cancer, we know where in the DNA these mutations lie, that means that if it's lying somewhere else, we can begin looking for what those deltas are. And that's where having more links into the HR really come in, particularly if they have a history of any one of those other kinds of cancers. Can we begin thinking about how to process the same data set? And therein lies kind of a wet lab approach to intellectual property, the dry lab approach, and then in the backdrop, you have this data lake that you can't put a patent on per se, but nobody else is building it. You can buy data from any number of these research institutions, from other sample collection systems for blood stools blood and stool, for example. What you can't do is saliva. It just doesn't exist out in the wild. And so we'll be building that foundation. And if you start thinking about that, plus blood work, plus stool work, plus urine work, you're looking at a multi-omic gold mine of information to be able to better understand how to treat an individual.
It occurs to me, we started out this conversation. I asked, what are the questions that the investors ask, and they say, "What's your data play?" And now we've been talking almost a half an hour, and very little science. Almost all of the conversation that you brought up is really data. Like it's really data. How do you manage your data? How do you handle your data? It's interesting to look at how valuable, this information is for you specifically with, sputum testing data. But I think in a lot of cases, scientific founders find that they end up pivoting towards the data that, the unique aspects of what their data that they're collecting is able to bring to the marketplace more quickly and more directly than they probably expected initially. I've seen it. I've seen it in other areas as well. I think we're coming a little bit close to the end of the time here, and I want to ask one last question before we see. I don't see any questions from the audience quite yet, but if there are, we'll grab some of those. So if you do have questions in the audience, please add those to the list here. But Harold, I think you've got what looks to be a successful startup on the way here. You've got some other startups in your background, scientific startups. So maybe give it a little bit of advice to those that are out there that are scientific founders. They've got some compelling IP, perhaps, probably coming from a university, just as you have from the University of Chicago, but haven't really grappled with informatics yet. What advice would you give in terms of, what's your next steps in terms in building a company around IP like yours?
Yeah, I think, whether it's a physician or it's an academic researcher, what you typically wind up not having at the table is somebody that can kind of think with the end in mind of how is it going to be used in the market? What are the usability features of the product? What are the digital features that you need to wrap around a hard product? And whether it's a drug or a device, a combination, or a robotic arm that's doing something in a medical setting. What's going to be really important early days is having somebody on board, an advisor, a mentor, somebody that can help guide and shape this. Too often, if left with a sea of applications that you can take the technology, which one should we be focused in on early? And having some guidance for that is going to help get you over uncomfortable discussions with the first couple of investors that you talk to. And honestly, I think grant funders or givers are doing a little bit better job. Even family offices are doing a more sophisticated job about asking those types of questions and saying it's not just enough to say that you're just going to get into the market here or there, but better understand not just what the total addressable market is, but within that addressable market, where is a unique killer app first application going to be? Because unless you do that first killer application, you're not going to get permission to do much of the other and do the platform expansion that you'd like to accomplish.
That's so important, and I think that the experience that you brought to this process and just sort of the go-to-market plan was something that I found unique in our initial conversations, and I still do find unique because it's exactly that. It's easy enough to identify a total addressable market or a TAM. It's another thing altogether to say, how are you going to capture even enough of that total addressable market to prove the concept? And being able to step back and be able to talk about that as a founder with your investors, I think is a really critical, and not only just to be able to talk with your investors, but to be able to actuate that as you have, so that you can prove this idea out. As you said, we don't know for sure how it's going to turn out, but what we do know is that at the end of a few months here, we're going to know whether this really is an idea that works or not, because we're actuating it in real live scenarios, and asking operating dentists to take this test on. And again, that the most of the work that we did with you technically, and I know a lot of the work that you and Patrick and your team did, operationally was really about getting to that go-to-market strategy in actuation. There just been amazing to watch you get to this point. I'm so excited to see, what happens as you do get to the market here
Yeah,
over.
stay tuned and follow us. I think it's going
Yeah,
to be an interesting story, particularly as we're seeing big diagnostic providers get into the more consumerized space. Again,
yeah,
we've
yeah,
seen it right here in the Midwest with Abbott's acquisition of Exact Sciences.
yeah, yeah.
And before that, they were doing the lollipop assays for COVID. And before that, they were doing glucose monitoring for diabetes. But then, lo and behold, there's a group of otherwise healthy individuals, typically athletes, that want to have a better sense of their quantified self. And so we're going to be seeing a lot more of this democratization of healthcare, and it's going to come up with these, user patient initiated, member initiated tests that are going to be able to help inform better decision making and clinical intervention, hopefully earlier in the disease progression.
Well, and make sure you take credit for, companies like yours and what you and OrisDX are doing to sort of vanguard that, because I couldn't agree more. That is the future of healthcare. But it's because of people like you and because of technology like this that we're going to see this actuated. So congratulations on this. I promise we are going to bring you back again in 6 months, and we'll talk about at that point what we've learned and what's happening next. But thank you. I think I see a comment here just saying that there's some other folks in the audience that have gone through the journey of actuating a concept to a saleable product, and it is a bumpy process as you've identified here. It's certainly not easy. Probably, I would say, not for the faint of heart, but I think worth it in the end. So, I don't see any other questions here. Harold, do you have any last comments before we wrap up here and hand it back to Austin?
I look forward to being invited back in a few months and sharing our where are they now stories.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we'll be able to say we knew him when.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Austin. I think you've got some follow-up here to let people know about some upcoming webinars as well.
That is true. Thank you again, Harold. I'm going to just get this screen shared. Thank you guys for watching. We're taking a small break. We won't have a Yahara Live next month. We've got some of our team members will be out approaching or out attending and speaking at some pretty big conferences. So taking a small break. If you want to know when our next edition of Yahara Live will be, make sure you follow us on LinkedIn. That's where you'll get all the best updates. But until then, thank you guys for joining. Have a good rest of your day.